Hello everyone, today we introduce the Hussite Wars, not because we haven't made, as we did in fact, several videos about Hussite Warfare already, but because, as you know, every once in a while we do need an introduction, a broader overview, in this case on a topic that is really wide in a general sense, but it has also a lot of historiographical implications, not just for the Czech national spirit and identity, the sense that essentially this was the pinnacle of their at least popularized military historical capacity. In fact, there are more interesting topics about Czech military history, also more important ones for that matter. As you know, I wrote a thesis on Ottokar II of Bohemia, among the other things. But in fact, for the general reception of this topic comparatively to other chapters of medieval warfare, right? I will be very frank here, because we have already covered some battles about the Hussite War, some military historical units. We already discussed Bohemia around this date, and specifically about how the Bohemian Diet worked during the Hussite rebellion, the socio-political preconditions for the pre-Hussite period socio-political conditions in Bohemia, etc. And we have already seen how the Hussites were indeed good at their job, right? From a strictly moral point of view, they achieved a lot. They scored many victories over superior enemies. They really became famed as terrifying for anyone involved, including themselves, given that they also ended up killing one another. To a degree, we'll partly see it today. There is no doubt, equally, I think this is pretty straightforwardly honest as objective, overrated in a strictly art of war history sense. Right, and the picture is extremely simple. I think that the Hussites do deserve, of course, all the attention that they get at large. They also get a few, like any other medieval and generally speaking historical topic, but the proportion, and as you know, I'm very, very careful about the diachronic and comparative teaching of the art of war, especially when it comes to the Middle Ages. They get comparatively more attention than other topics, and they essentially get a disproportionate hype for tactics that, as effective as they could be, were actually normal and actually not that original to begin with, and that must be understood only in the specific political and strategical context in which those clashes took place, right? Had the Czechs here, had the Hussites specifically, for their more famous, popularized Wagon, etc., fought in countries like France or Italy, they would have been wiped out. But we somehow get, especially from an historiography that wanted to essentially overemphasize this proto-Reformation stemming from Hus and the Hussite movement, etc., that there was some sort of revolutionary military reform progress behind the Hussite military system, and there wasn't any of this. Like, if you really want to look at the very powerful legacy of the Hussites, you have to look at the political meaning of those clashes, not much the technical side of the story, in the capacity of having been able to stand their ground against the nobility, knights. The Hussites definitely contribute to that gradual, essentially, passage from a cavalry to an infantry dominated warfare, but it's not absolutely a categorical step toward that direction. The Hussites were essentially just fighting with what they had, and there was no sort of military legacy of sort. What they were really able to spread further, that was also collected by the reformers in 16th century Germany, where many of them emigrated, because in all of this, by the way, Bohemia went destroyed. I mean, in the 14th century, we've seen it recently, with Charles IV. This is notorious. Many people romanticize the Hussites. They all talk about the Wagon. Do you know that Bohemia lost 1/3 of its population during the Hussite Wars? It was basically razed to the ground, and it, because of the Hussites, lost its independence and was ruled for centuries up to the 20th by the Habsburgs. You know that's the direct consequence of the magnitudinal failure of the Hussite movement. Do you have the palest idea of that Bohemia became a failed state as a consequence of this, that, you know, all these distractions, all this that served absolutely nothing. It was a Czech civilization thriving up to a few generations before it was annihilated by the same Czech Hussites. Well, that's the point. The only legacy that Hussites really spread is the one of hatred against authority. That was, again, incredibly effective in Germany during the Reformation. Also, from a military point of view, I recently made a video, so little video series about the German peasant revolt that is quite educational, also because also this movement was the largest rebellion before the French Revolution, and they got virtually all exterminated, and or at least, you know, talking up to the hundreds of thousands there by scale. So in many ways, the Hussites, I could speak for hours about this, but the Hussites fit in this sort of tail strike of the failed, exclusively failed peasant revolts of the late Middle Ages, stemming from the late medieval crisis, that had, again, as the exclusive outcome the radical and traumatic subordination of the peasantry into a non-representative and completely subservient role until the revolutions of from the 18th to the 20th century, without any possibility of going anywhere with that. Right? There is this, again, romanticization of the allegedly modern progress or whatever happened, regardless of any ideological implication that is, unfortunately, this language is always replete with, and that the masses, for very specific psychological reasons, buy into by default, hoping to hide their own shortcomings. Actually, if there is a moment in which, by definition, people lost importance in relative terms in the political, institutional, juridical system, it's the modern age. Right? In medieval times, estates like the peasant one had more autonomy, right? And it's only in, say, the age of mass society, in the last couple of hundred years, not even, in some areas of Central Eastern Europe, as a matter of fact, just 100 years or so, that people got, again, back some kind of actual, say, individual liberty within systems, of course, are much bigger than then, so it's not like they acquired more than much to begin with in terms of actual control, so not much really changed. I know that some people just are cognitively dissonant about this, and it's a problem, but this is not a historical interpretation. This is literally what the entire known historiography about modern society, modern politics, univocally tells you about the absolute and relative relations of power between government and people about the modern age. If you miss that in the creation of the modern state, of government, if you think that was a moment of, you know, increased individual liberty, you may want to actually revise, if anything, your school books. I mean, where I come from, there is not even a need to go to university to learn these things, because you may have completely missed the ABC of one entire era. The modern era did not exist, by the way. And it's a severe problem. I mean, it's a severe problem that there are allegedly adult people that vote, drive cars, have children that actually believe this, because they are collectively damaging us at large. It's also our fault for having them created to begin with, but you know, that's another point. When it gets to the Hussites, there is nothing romantic about this. This was a massive, clamorous disaster that brought the country nowhere, right? Brought actually to much worse people in charge, because basically the nobility was decimated. The ones who really knew how to handle things were knocked out. New enriched people were just there for the money, took over. and succeeded also to become the next establishment, and chapeau to them in a sense, but they weren't better than the guys who existed before. And the peasantry got dramatically worse than it was before. So the Hussite Wars were a huge, nonsensical disaster that was good for nothing and for no one, right? If not a very few people that, however, started living in a country that had ever less relevance in the international scenario. Since this is a military historical channel, of course, we analyze the military side of the story, for which I repeated, chapeau also to the Hussites. Their epos is completely justified in a narrative sense. I like them, right? Even in a ferociously anti-radical sense. I do always give even the devil its due. These were good, they were motivated people. And yet other thing that people don't understand, you don't need wagons, guns. Also other peoples had them, and they actually had much better armies in many ways and did not need to use what the Hussites needed to use just because of the peculiar situations. They were extremely limited within that relatively limited theater of Central Europe. And the only thing that matters, really, you can argue in war, at least from which all the rest proceeds, is how much you want to rip out the intestines of the person who's in front of you. What you have in your hands does not matter. What matters is how bloodthirsty you are. There is no other way to fight a war. This is the third person of the Clausewitzian Trinity coming from the people. Remember always that in broader community system, it's the people that produce blind primordial hatred, not the government, not the military, but the people. They're all intertwined, as you understand, they all overlap. But without that, you can't win wars, right? Also without, of course, the military expertise, without the political direction. But in many ways, these rebellions are more like this popular outburst, right, of these areas of Europe that, as we were saying before, essentially came later in terms of development, and therefore rebelled in times and conditions that were essentially already being passed by other countries. In fact, did not have this, had settled the matter the previous century. And we're going, if anything, to discuss this in some video about the socio-economic, yet another video about the socio-economical background of the Hussite Wars, because again, the motivations to be that bloodthirsty did exist. The Hussites had plenty of them. But the fundamentals must be clear since the beginning. In other words, the Hussites are an excellent chapter of military history in showing how technology actually is more than overrated, doesn't make the thing, and moral forces in terms of that determination are instead everything, right? So people have to explain some to general progressism and technologism of what was happening, but just dialectically framed the picture in the, in fact, diametrically opposite sense. There was nor progress, nor this was achieved, say, the military victories of the Hussites were achieved for, in fact, a broader successful political end, but also through any specific tactical, complications or the systems that nobody had ever thought before. We'll explain all this now. But basically all my videos about the Hussites revolve around this topic, which is, again, a compliment to the Hussites. It's not like saying they were dumb. They weren't, right? They were smart, and they succeeded. At this level, politically and societally at large, no. And also, the precondition of the country, including the fact that it was, by this point, relatively peripheral to where other things were sort of starting to compact in a more, truly their progressive sense, so we can say we're not theirs. There's no doubt that Jan Zizka and his army represented thus a very important chapter in medieval warfare, but absolutely not a pinnacle of military organization, not even in the 15th century. By far, the Bande d'Ordonnance of Charles the Bold were, or the Venetian Condotta were, right? The Hussites definitely, just by the political and institutional context in which they framed it, could not be the pinnacle of any military organization in an entire century, even just limited to European history. The Hussites were characterized, as you know, by religious zealotry, right? And they were essentially a loosely connected assembly of, and here it's difficult to approximate, they were not Czech nationalists, as sometimes Czech history wanted to depict them in later times of later historiography and mass society that would have also disgusted the same Hussites, even as heretics. We can, however, see some important national bias in this. The notion is that essentially the Bohemian monarchy, the Luxembourgs that had been called after the end, or at least the female continuation of the Przemyslit dynasty into the same Western, as French, still Holy Roman Imperial, Germanic kingdom, but French-speaking and cultured dynasty, that for this very reason had understood quite early in time the importance of turning this pretty big kingdom in the heart of Europe into the new center of general mediation, organization, control of large swaths of Europe in a broader political and strategical sense, by getting the best of Western civilization from the more advanced areas. We've again seen this just recently in the video about Charles IV that rebuilds the royal chapel in Prague on the basis of Saint Denis, as he had been brought up himself at the court of Paris. There was a lot of Italianate, Latinate influence at the Luxembourg courts. There was also the best of the German Gothic, and of course also Czech contributions, but at large this greater power sharing by estates that, as you know, also during the Ostsiedlung were more prominent. The Germans had it better than the Slavic peasantry, generally speaking, the towns, as knights, as people who essentially had been imported from centuries, by the way, even during the Czech Przemyslik times, into these Western Slavic countries, not only in order to strengthen the crown against the ethnic nobility. So between one thing and another, this perceived Germanization and many other reasons, this is just for the national sake, right, was understood as a threat to the Czech establishment. In part, some noblemen did side with the Hussites that were the useful idiots in terms of violent scum of the earth that could be weaponized against for whichever political purpose, that also went out of hand, because these were not really the kind of people you could simply control. In fact, as we were saying before, the Hussites would be more prone to infighting among also other Czechs than to collective force against shared adversaries. The notion again of the Czech-German division is overly stressed by the later nationalistic historiography, now is surpassed as well. There is some of it, but it's not like there wouldn't be, say, who were the Czechs and who were the Germans in Bohemian. Just like today, if you look at the country, it's all so blurred in many ways from an ethnic point of view that since the migration era, it doesn't even make too much sense to overly stress. But remember that in the Middle Ages, being part of either one of the two groups is preeminently a juridical matter, right? There are some sort of German towns that call in Czechs that eventually become German by that town law, and so it's complex, and this is the reason why we need to talk so much more about Bohemian history during this time. As you know, the Hussites' most prominent leader was Jan Zizka, called like this because it was a one-eyed company commander, actually, whose prior military involvement consisted solely of a single campaign and siege abroad, along with a few years of guerrilla tactics, so not really the top-notch sort of military curriculum available in Europe at the time, but enough for adapting to the Hussite circumstances and making him, in fact, one of the most famous leaders of the Middle Ages. The Hussite adversaries included the two principal powers of the medieval era that are transnational in this regard. They're universal. They are the church, and you could say the empire from one side, because, as you know, the Czechs themselves had managed to gain the imperial crown for Prague. But we could say, in the sense, also the nobility. Yes, there was also a strong societal issue. It's notorious that in, say, Central Europe, even worse, the more east you go, the peasantry were treated as racially inferior beings, barely human beings. As a matter of fact, we've seen it also in the video about the peasant revolts. Luther said, like, kill them all as rabid dogs if they rebel. In Western Europe, the condition of the average peasant even was completely different. And this is why the Hussite revolt has this very specific context you have to frame it into, because, again, Central Europe is not Western Europe, it's not also Eastern Europe, but the sense of the steppes, right, that still essentially are around, also as a broader military culture. I made recently a video about, in fact, Bohemian warfare between, if anything, the 11th and the 14th century. We noticed how, even though this was sort of the most westernized, the most Germanized Slavic country, it still has here and there a pinch, a hint, or some other indicator of some steppe character, some lighter bias, some more predatory, more raiding world. And in a sense, it's a bit Sarmatism in Poland. The Czech nationalism later cavalcated this a bit as well, with certain symbols, with certain art. In fact, the Hussites were quite romanticized at the time. If you look at the Olduvai pictures that I used here, beautiful art from great artists of the time, and you understand that specific temper, the specific style, that specific feeling that was eventually attached to the Hussites, that, as you know, any medieval history people, and even more in areas, sort of relatively less documented areas like this, it's not like we know too much in depth what happened, for example, during the Hussite battles. It remains a bit shredded in mystery, and that was sort of rewoven into later times. We shouldn't simply despise, 19th century reconstructions because they were biased by sort of National Socialism, anti-traditional mass society, Fortestater ideologies. There was actually a lot of historical research of medieval historiography being formed, but of course there were specific ideas that molded our own understanding and sort of reception, so to say, of the Hussites in this case as a popular legacy. The church and the nobility depended both on a military force themselves. They were the real establishment. And this is especially true in Central Europe, because in Central Europe, population is sparser, there are less communications, there are less cities, and at large, the great problem, especially of the 15th century Central European monarchies, is that they are essentially failed states, right? They have failed in the process of monarchic concentration, right? What we call national monarchies in a broader sense, but it actually have to do with statehood. And this is not England, this is not France, this is not Castile, this is not even some German powers to an extent. This is not Italian states. This is a very different world that needs sort of much more glue historically, right? They're more distant from civilization. They have less sense of public and civil culture and organization. They are essentially oligarchic, privatistic countries. The nobility controls everything. Basically, everybody is somebody else's person, and at the same time, a de facto serf, right? It's also a country that, as we'll see now, is undergoing some general political crisis, because even though Prague was definitely the heart of 14th century Europe, it's not like, simply you could recover from lack of hundreds of years of, stronger monarchic authority, like it was the case in these lands, even though Bohemia was, again, very westernized, very Germanized. And that, as you understand, when put together as factors, is not really the best recipe for success, right? The church and the nobility were backed by the knightly orders, right, of Germany, of other Central European powers. The 15th century is the one of the Ottoman invasions, of the great military orders that vow to stop the infidels. But that at the same time are ruling, especially in Central Europe, some dysfunctional polities that do not really hold together as much as they should. This is evident, I don't know, in Hungary. Bohemia is in between greater powers and is gradually losing its own independence in many ways. In part exactly because of the undermining that such movements cause against the establishment. It's not like they weren't exploited, they were oppressed in many ways, but this depended on them primarily, not much on their lords that simply had established their leadership as the only cornerstone that could keep things together by that degree. And again, the Hussites went nowhere as an alternative to that. On the contrary, they ruined and destroyed a European nation. The nobility would maintain also its dominance during this period and further. By the conclusion, in fact, of their adventure, the Hussites had surely acquired great military reputation, having successfully defied an emperor, but they also had not been able to keep together as a popular movement. As you know, Hussitism lived on, we'll see it especially in the end, but on a country that had basically severed, had basically cut its own legs and had been shortened and had much less rich than before, and where in fact those legs were literally, lots of people were exterminated in the process. You have also the Zizka history, so to say, showing like the tragedy of this whole, right? The guy became entirely blind towards the end of his life. That was concluded behind also the promise that he would have been turned into a drum, by using his skin to guide his men in battle, also in death. He was satisfied of that, and that tells you a bit the pretty cute and tender, temper of the Bohemian military culture of the time. That would be, at least in terms of blindness, the sole battle that Jan Zizka would lose despite the prolonged duration of the wars were something terrible. I mean, from a sheer psychophysical point of view, what these this is what really should attract you about the Hussites and many other commanders of the year. I mean, the kind of psychophysical toll that prolonged warfare and command especially exacted on these figures. You had to be of monumental, cyclopical, granitic strength in order to even imagine to be able to have a military curriculum like Zizka's. As the 15th century approached, bit of a step back, the feudal realm of Bohemia was evidently on the brink of upheaval. The followers of the executed reformer Jan Hus, that basically had anticipated all the reformed remonstrances against the church and constituted order, were growing in strength and numbers. Of course, the church was included within the nobility at large, at least as the establishment. Bishops owned land like the great lay magnates of the country, and they exercised this in a very positive way, a reason for which also from the side of some lay noblemen, the prospect of seizing the ecclesiastical estates was quite alluring, quite attractive, right? This also went against the ultimate authority of the region, that is the monarchy, or this should have been the emperor from a secular point of view, but this was a time of great, decline of the same Luxembourg imperial dynasty as properly universal power, and Bohemia fits princely Germany at large. We made multiple videos explaining how the system really worked there. Given that, however, papacy and empire still existed and were sort of recovering from sort of tougher relations in the previous generations, to maintain as many of these other leaders, especially in Central Europe, control on as much communities as possible, the the imperial authority backed the Roman Church and vice versa, advocating for repression of such populistic movements that were just aiming at essentially stealing property of this elite that, of course, had its own armed retinues, had a general role to play. The rebels knew nothing better about how to run a country, and they would disastrously demonstrate it by self-destroying. But the tensions, the conflict, the hatred arising from this situation is at least understandable in historical perspective. King Wenceslas was known as a weak and indecisive monarch, nothing like his ancestors had managed to found that great prestige and power of the Bohemian crown. He attempted ineffective measures to placate the various sides involved in the clash, only managing to incite anger from each faction. From a political and institutional point of view, we will see this. Right? We will see who these people were. Partially, we have already done it. Today we talk about the military side of the story, so we will not get into the otherwise very, very complicated and non-dichotomic picture here. Wenceslas died in 1419, in time for witnessing the early stages of the violent Hussite uprisings. This immediately characterized themselves for the brutality and violence of it all. King Sigismund of Hungary, who also held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and that it was Wenceslas' stepbrother. This is essentially the last great ruler of the Luxembourg house that has preferred to migrate to the bigger, the more important kingdom under his control, because this is exactly what the Central European rulers wanted to do. They realized it was some sort of societal upheaval, so they would marry into each other, collecting multiple crowns at a time, called by the local nobility, trying essentially to get a tiny bit of surplus from all these possessions, a surplus that was essentially insufficient for the single country sort of power concentration, because the oligarchy would have prohibited it, because they wanted just to leave on their own without any greater authority, and basically undermining the foundations of their own countries in the process. Hungary, again, would be the most colossal example of that, at least in that short while against the Turks. And at least concentrating all the resources taken from here and there to at least establish a strong court, attempting to sort of navigate themselves against the oligarchic ambitions, trying to reinforce at least one of these kingdoms at large. We don't have to explain the context, why this guy could be Holy Roman Emperor and Hungarian king at the same time, and more, given that he was, in fact, the rightful ruler also to the Bohemian throne. At least he was one of the claimants, because there were other noblemen that would, at least it was easy. If you're backed by a nobiliar faction, you can get into the fray. This had been the case also for Bohemia for a long time, even under the Przemyslids. Even though at this point we are in a phase of contraction, right? The system is not actually growing, it's starting to be fully destabilized. And Bohemia had been one of the countries, together with Poland, to actually get some of the best of the general post-Black Death conditions in Europe, right? But now this, say, relatively fast and unprecedented growth became unbalanced, did not have very strong foundations. Having been part of the Council of Constance, which branded Jan Hus as a heretic and resulted in his burning at the stake in 1415, the Hussites staunchly opposed Sigismund. We'll talk about the Council of Constance, the one of Basel. A lot is going on, like the crisis of the papacy, for example, of its universal authority is marked. Actually, the Papal States would come back on their feet exactly starting from this point onwards, and they will try to reassert the same level of ecclesiastical control of Europe of the previous era. I made a video about Roman papal power in the 15th century if you're interested in that. Sigismund was backed by the Roman Church, with fears of persecution from the Hungarian king. Fervent Hussites readied themselves for open war. This meant to really go out to war against the current claimant to the Bohemian throne, the legitimate one. There was also one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. The looming threat of foreign invasion from both Hungary and Germany led many moderates to support the revolt as well. Right? It was understood. There is a national component, as we were saying before, inasmuch as it's understood that Bohemia is fragile now, and more powerful neighbors can coalesce forces to invade it and conquer pieces of that, as it will actually happen during at least the continuation of the Hussite Wars. Also, Poland was not really a nice neighbor most of the times. There were some areas over which, say, the power of the crown was just nominal, and everything was sort of broken and infiltrated by foreign powers. This would actually increase during the Hussite Wars rather than stopping. But initially, there was enough sense of national cohesion to take up arms, exploiting these other religious, social issues. Remember that the nobility largely supports this, at least part of the nobility, especially the smaller one that has less to lose and at least understands that there is an opportunity for promotion in this bloodshed. They would be largely wrong, by the way. Opposition to Sigismund was based on religious issues, as we've seen, and the complicated legal matters concerning the connection between the deceased king's bloodline and Sigismund's. Motivated by these apprehensions, the rebellion's scope and influence broadened, often without a clear plan and defined allegiances, which would in fact largely complicate the entire issue. Without political unity, you can't really do a few in war. Jan Zizka became involved in the Hussite insurrection while Wenceslas was still alive, despite his previous position in the king's court. Zizka was a minor landholder from southern Bohemia. These were the kind of people who saw in the Hussite uprising some sort of opportunity for their meager resources, right? And sharing ideas that were in part of the same rebellious kind, backed by this new interpretation of Christianity, of the prerogatives of the church, the authority of the papacy. In many ways, Europe is further nationalizing. I mean, the universal authorities are ever more powerful in relative terms. They're actually gaining power. Like by the 16th century, the papacy, the empire were not weak, right? But it was ever more difficult to simply extend, after the late medieval crisis, a universal control, like say in the 13th century, over Europe in a truly universal framework of power. So Bohemia, that was, yes, the center of Europe, but not much now the beating heart of it anymore, at least a heart that was gradually running out of blood to pump, at least hoped that from this uprising some further autonomization could come. Instead, essentially the country was ever more exposed to foreign control. And even though, yes, we've seen it also in the videos about the early modern Habsburgs, there was, especially at the beginning of the period, some kind of almost falling asleep once again into this mystical Mytho-European lens that would maintain almost a medieval character up to the last century in our history. The further decentralization of Bohemia from the great European powers, it was something that they had essentially acquired for themselves just a very short time before, would make the country fall back right, in centuries of political and institutional hard work, right? All the work made by the Premislits, by the Luxembourgs, was basically nullified with this disaster. In his younger years, Zizka participated in the raiding warfare that plagued southern Bohemia. Again, these are barely civilized places. You still have, I don't know, Cumans roaming around. There is this absolute contempt towards the peasantry that are really understood as substandard animals. It's completely fine to raid, to set on fire, to cut to pieces, to rape, and whatever. This is, the habitual nice countryside landscape of Central Europe in the later Middle Ages. Later, Zizka fought under the Polish king against the Teutonic Knights. It's a very important theater we have to make more content on. That was, if anything, better school than one of his provincial background. It is believed that on this occasion Zizka gained valuable experience in siege warfare. Made recently a video about siege warfare in general, medieval times, understanding its complications, but also its greatness and the enormous effort and intelligence that it required. And especially it's likely that he encountered the Wagon fort tactics used by the Ruthenian and Lithuanian forces on that occasion. We'll talk more about the Wagenburg because we already done it in other videos about Hussite tactics. I made a video just about that, so if you really are obsessed with this, you should check that out more than today's one. And as I was saying before, was Hussite warfare innovative? No. Why? Because the Wagenburg was used essentially by every single people on earth having a wagon since ever. Right, I don't know how to stress this. It's particularly true among steppes peoples because those are more often on the march altogether as entire communities. They are semi-nomadic. And they know how to make a much greater use, especially in this open grounds of essentially a fortress of wagons. This is still done today with pickups, trucks in, I don't know, very open ground areas like deserts, etc. It's just a universal strategy. Doesn't require any specific brilliance to think. It does require capacity to use it, to be able and fast with this wagon organization. The Czechs were definitely less used to it compared to the Ruthenians and the Lithuanians, but at large they were also more familiar with it, considering the proximity of the steppes that's just next door really to their country, in order to adopt it and to adapt it to make the most of it. There is also another point. The Hussites were often inferior to their enemies, reason for which they had to pass to the defensive. We've seen it in the videos about the German Peasant uprising. I talk profusely about this when discussing the 100 Years' War. What do you think that the English decided at some point to dismount their men-at-arms to dig in and to entrench themselves? Because, there were geniuses of military history. I mean, guys like Edward III definitely were. But in general, and that nobody had ever thought to vote like that. The times that were changing. Our infantry was now thought to be the magic weapon that nobody had thought of, because the noblemen are stupid, lesser people must believe nowadays to feel better about being failures. No, it's simply because they were inferior in number. Their position sucked, so they preferred to exploit the advantages of defense rather than risking a cavalry charge in which they were, say, 3-1, and they simply could not win to begin with, right? And with all the shortcomings deriving from that, I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers. That is one of the 1356 one. It's actually one of the single most beautiful battles I've ever covered. The masterpiece of the Black Prince. There we can see it relatively less, but even if you don't have a mounted force, even the fact of finally crushing the enemy, pursuing him, or knowing what was going on in the surroundings. So it becomes ever more difficult. It's not an optimal situation. Had the English not been, say, in that numerical inferiority, they would have fought like the French would have fought. By the time of Azincourt, actually, infantry was becoming more important, also for other reasons. There is no doubt that it was growing in importance as an arm, but at large, and especially in Central Europe, the prevalence of cavalry was self-evident and obvious. This was still the case, say, in the same France, in the same Italy, in the same Spain. Definitely countries that had not much to envy to anyone in terms of military development at the time, and using, in fact, more proactive and combined arms tactics that would have been devastating had they ever met, let's say, a Hussite Wagon that would have been just demolished by artillery shots had there been enough of them in these fringe areas of Central Europe where the Hussites operated as some kind of murderers, brigands that definitely were not swimming in gold or controlling who knows what kind of civilization. So the entire notion that the Wagon techniques for the Hussite cause would have been so innovatively adaptive is incorrect, right? Any army in the Hussite condition would have thought to dig in and to protect themselves in a very organized, drilled way, especially if they were, experienced professional forces of some sort, some forces with enough military practice back in the years. You do entrench, like the entire siege warfare of the era at large, or the castles that the same Hussites defended from, or any other country defended from at this point, were conceived exactly in the same way. The Wagon fort is not really per se anything more practical or useful that would have resolved the military problems of the time. Otherwise, everybody would have adopted it. Again, there is nothing that anyone takes from the Hussites in terms of this kind of, Wagon fort tactics and organization. Maybe a bit the Hungarians against the Turks on the southern border, but at large, if you have more robust fortifications somewhere, you can simply, as field fortifications normally are, you can build them if you have enough resources, if you have strong points, etc., whatever, you will exploit them. You may privilege mobility. These are, again, more open ground terrains, sometimes, not always, by the way. In fact, these wagons were used sometimes with sort of very elementarily primitive functions, such as, throwing them downhill loaded with rocks onto an approaching battle line, right? That doesn't quite require much explanation, as much as the fact that you can do it once if you're lucky and you find the actual circumstance for which you can do it. Otherwise, it's not something that is going to be replicated in the rest of the art of war, because guess what? Military systems are not simply the fruit of some extemporary sort of whim or wishful thinking. They actually come on top of hundreds of years of military experience at some of the highest levels of political and strategical action. So it's a bit different thing. When you see the Hussite victories, you have to understand, first of all, their context. And when you realize what it was by scale, these were not very big armies to begin with, as compared to the rest of Europe. They were not achieving massive military feats, I don't know, conquering a major city or, crushing armies of tens of thousands of men, entirely annihilating them, taking over entire countries. No, this is not what the Hussites did. Definitely, they defended pretty hard, because just if you are on the defensive in general, it means that you have a disadvantage that you are trying to gap with the enemy by exploiting that strong but also negative kind of war as von Clausewitz explains, meaning that defense does have an intrinsic advantage over the attack, but it also doesn't have a positive aim. I mean, it's not really unlocking any broader purpose other than hoping to resist in that moment, and if anything, only later passing to counterattack. As we will see, there is also this notion that wagons were used aggressively, that they could surround the enemies with that. That mostly, I say it immediately, comes from the scripts of Silvius Aeneas Piccolomini, that, by the way, was an enemy of the Hussites and was representing this sort of snake kind of wagon columns for symbological, say, reasons. That he was basically saying that the Hussites were demonic in some ways, and there is actually no proof that any tactic of this kind was otherwise ever used, or that would have been feasible or advantageous to begin with. If you want to interlock wagon force, loading them in soldiers, in guns, etc., fine. It's a general, absolute strategic principle. You want to build a fortress. You can't do it because you're out there in the open. You have to close up in that way. Fine. It's obvious. It's a form of defense. It's something that others in the Hussite conditions would have done anyway. But the Hussites would do this just because they were in that particular condition that others were not to begin with. Zizka's fame is, of course, enormous, right? There is this contemporary linguistical debate still about whether Zizka, meaning one-eyed, was given to him due to the loss of his eye in his youth, or whether the term evolved posthumously to reference his disability. Because, by the way, this is always the case for alleged military reformers, even the ones that actually carried out overall reforms, that we don't even know whether they introduced any particular innovation per se, especially from a technical point of view in their life. We just have much later evidence of that happening in their same armies, say generations after their death. We're talking Gustavus Adolphus, even Marius. Armies just change by themselves. They do not really need an autocrat that simply changes it overall. You can at best formalize, sanction this, and you can especially use this system for the best purposes. There is no doubt. These were all great commanders, capable leaders, including Zizka, but it's not like there was any particular technical specificity in the tactical success of these systems, and also in the general, say, strategical and political ones. Speaking of moral motivations, the teachings of Hus had deeply resonated with the ordinary people of Bohemia and Moravia, who constituted the backbone of the rebellion. They had had enough, right, of the abuses of the nobility, of the church. They also simply wanted to vent their own peasant, say, instinctive desire for riches, violence, destruction, like the most primitive animal-like behavior that just reasons in the very short term, as these people were fundamentally obliged to do. Sigismund, being distant from Bohemia, struggled to enforce his decrees in all this. There's all political, institutional drama consuming in all this, because you're trying also to avoid the war that costs a lot. As we were saying before, these countries barely have resources for any major prolonged campaign. So if anything is falling apart, you must at least try to prevent it to avoid any bloodier and expensive confrontation. Sigismund, by the way, still enjoyed the support of the majority of the Czech nobility. The Hussites turned against the church mostly, which supported Sigismund's claim to power over the heretical rebels, because of course that was also all one with the conflict. The Hussites burned down monasteries, normal target for the riches contained in that, plundering church properties, but avoiding, at least in a first moment, and perhaps also because they were fighting mostly against less militarized opponents, excessive violence, thereby attracting converts in the towns surrounding Prague for their base of power. The latter were mostly the more ideologues, were a bit like the third estate. There's intelligentsia that, as you know, is also designed in many ways to provoke the fourth estate against the rightful rulers. Prague, like it's like Paris during the Jacquerie, London during the revolts of the year with Tyler, John Bowles, etc. They think that they have a more mercantile mindset, and they think that if, say, the state fails further, they can essentially benefit mostly from the absence of a major power exacting taxes from them, tolls on trade and so on, so that it can become this great unregulated market where the mob can do whatever they want. Nevertheless, the Roman Church and the nobility were now uniting against the Hussites, and a major escalation was to follow. When you look at the times, you realize that the Hussites were not much in because they believed that their cause was necessarily going to succeed. On the contrary, they were out there out of sheer desperation. There were all these political, religious, social issues compounded. Again, it's not like we have to feel sorry for them, but you do understand what they say, why they behaved the way they did, with no better solutions for the overall problems, but still with this notion, okay, well, if we're going to go down, because they were feeling really the pressure of late medieval crisis, and understanding that, as it would happen in later centuries, that either they rose up in that moment, or they would have not succeeded in earning anything, right? Like a fourth estate representation in the parliament. This was a possibility also in Western Europe throughout the late Middle Ages, but they failed. These groups failed because they didn't really have a broader sense of themselves or coordination of political capacity, which makes the Hussites romantic, at least in this historical perspective. Sigismund's supporters dominated the heavy cavalry in Bohemia and comprised almost all experienced military leaders. So we're talking about the big guns, like the big shots. Bohemia is a heavily and brutally feudal land. They fully feudalized by the 13th century. Yes, there is something more exotic, like maybe even some horse archery is still around, but at large, this is now fully westernized Slavic country that really has this massively powerful establishment of, say, heavily armored shock cavalrymen with this radically advanced collective training, but at the same time, a bit of a scantier one compared to the much more irregimented, say, Western countries that had, say, more homogeneous military organization, some more compact professional systems. Think again about the English indenture or the Italian condotta or something like that. So the prowess of the Bohemian Knights, we will surely make a video about the historical military unit of this time, was pretty high, but in terms of broader collective cohesion, they may be in fact insufficient, as will be the case against the Hussites, to fundamentally resolve the matter just from this fierce military background. They had many advantages in some ways. They controlled, for example, the majority of significant castles in the area. However, the problem of the Bohemian nobility is that they had always been a bit, divided from one another. They had supported different rebellions. They were also looking at the general center of the local populace. As we've seen, even in the video about the German peasant uprising, there would be some noblemen who did not really like these fanatics' ideas, but rather than ending up massacred, cut to pieces, and having his wives and daughters raped, they would sort of try to find a compromise, even pass to this guy's side, giving them support, whatever. Again, this is the same case for Zizka or any other leader of peasants in these areas. Like without that, there was always some knight, some man-at-arms at the head of these guys. They were never like just peasants. There was always a knightly element that could be just an elite that would side with them, that would teach them how to fight, how to line up. And without this element, really, these armies would have melted away, really, or they would have simply taken their stand to get butchered in open field. They would have preferred to, go in the woods and live as outlaws and making brigandage and guerrilla, etc. There was also a general international support towards Sigismund. Again, in a medieval perspective, these were just wretched heretics that had to be put down on the spot, quartered alive, burnt alive, just being put down like animals. Hence, in fact, like the general revolutionary background of this movement triggered the support of the neighboring countries' nobility at large. Nobility that, let's stress it, was always involved in warfare. At times they were now trying to organize, especially in Central Europe, to cope with the Ottoman advances in the Balkans. As you know, this is a pretty dreadful moment in history whereby major Crusader expeditions are crushed by the Turks. These countries understand better than others, at least, what that means from a continental perspective to receive these invasions and needing to coalesce with broader purposes that, however, also for this reason require money, require resources, and that the peasants that are essentially sabotaging the system do not want to pay, right? With the consequence that most of these countries will simply crumble, Bohemia included. The Hussites possessed one significant advantage. You can argue leadership is everything in some ways. Zizka himself, right, his military expertise was enough to quickly propel him to high-ranking positions within the Hussite leadership. The story is quite interesting, but at large there would be a general reputation. The nobility mostly knew one another. There was a shared military history background. Zizka was himself a fanatic, there is no doubt, but he was also a tactical genius, right? The way he managed to put things together and lead the Hussites towards the striking series of victories against some of the fiercest opponents of the time is nothing but inspiring. There is no doubt about this. He began to use the standard supply of wagons as makeshift barricades during battles because the Hussites started to behave in a predatory way. They couldn't quite simply take over the entire system per se, and they had to cope with foreign invasions as well, carrying out preemptive attacks and having to move quite quickly. So wagons were necessary to move, but also to protect themselves in open field, in situations and terrains that were also unknown to the same Hussites before getting there, and that would really be useful, helpful for them. There's this first battle at Sudomer in 1419, where Zizka arranged the wagons on one flank, forming a mobile wall that mitigated the royalists' cavalry from outflanking the Hussite infantry. This is a very sort of straightforward way to use essentially a field fortification, because let's be honest, that's what it is, right? This would happen also in other contexts. If you have a siege, you can't build a countervallation around the fortress as well as the one that as a wall to blockade the perimeter, to blockade any possible sortie, because if a stronger enemy is coming at you trying to break the siege, you have to fight, but you want to have this fortified support. Remember that the 15th century witnesses a great deal of field fortification. We're looking at it recently in that video about the Battle of Caravaggio. I also explained a bit of this in other videos about 15th century warfare in general. Right? It is true that cavalry is undergoing a crisis, and or at least battlefields have become smaller compared to the 13th century. The troops are more professional. The 15th century is the pinnacle of armor in general. There's starting to be serious artillery power around. So all this complicates. Say armies are smaller, but spaces are the same, and so at large, terrain and possible structures become more important in proportion. This is not like in the 13th century in which you had massive armies, mostly cavalry dominated, that therefore have to meet in a sort of a tournament ground, flat, long, wide, to crash with against, say, a battle line against another, to eventually seal in this dramatically speedy, aggressive, projective way. 15th century warfare is not like this. Men-at-arms, nobility are always central, right? But the possibility, in fact, for these to be dismounted increases in many ways. Zizka also made use of artillery. There is this notion that you find among some scholars, say military analysts of the Hussite Wars, that stresses the fact that, say, the nobility, the crusaders of Sigismund, wouldn't really have an equal amount of artillery. This is actually not true, meaning that the Hussites did not have huge pieces at all. Artillery per se was not, say, more important than crossbow fire at this point. Also not more important than the same robustness of heavy infantry defending a fortified position. It would help, right? Of course, crusaders, knights, men-at-arms on horseback are more prone to fight in a more conventional way. That is also incredibly aware of how this situation needs to be handled. Like the notion that the aristocrats were dumb because they didn't want to change warfare is a complete nonsense, right? As we were explaining before, as we've seen in other videos, there was no element in the entire medieval warfare more aware of the potential of infantry than the nobility. Also because they used infantrymen all the time, they needed them, and also because they themselves knew basically all about warfare, right? There is not, again, an equally challenging, say, a spectacularly challenging infantry peasant military culture that develops here that challenges the nobility, as some people believe, destroying cavalry. No, right? On the battlefields of Europe for generations, cavalry would remain the primary arm, and it's not the Hussites that really change anything in the political and social background by which this was to happen. On the contrary, especially again in Central Eastern Europe, cavalry remains for a much longer time compared to the West. These are systems that adapt much. We've seen it in the video about the German peasant rebellion. Like you mostly have you do have infantry, but some of the army, the Lorraine, for example, contingent, they were heavily feudal mounted armies that annihilate the peasantry, by the way. So in the same time which you have the same year literally of the Landsknechten and the Spanish gunners holding their ground against the French gendarmes at Pavia, right? They're literally the same people, the same Germans, the same imperial forces, but you need a big power in order to field a square of thousands of pikemen to be working, right? The northern German powers would essentially have a feudal army until the 30 Years' War. The same can be said about Bohemia at large. So let's not confuse this linear nonsense about progress and the deterministic rise of infantry as if these guys understood it all before. No. Also because this kind of uprising is actually one of the last of the, as we were saying before, of the sort of peasant bourgeois kind of later medieval mold that really ends fundamentally with the 16th century German peasant rebellions. I do not want to digress because there is not all the time in the world, but you know what it means. Like infantry would actually rise as the dominating army in the Renaissance, not because people were organizing themselves in armies of free infantrymen, but because these were now essentially proletarians, completely dependent on princes that were the only ones who had the wealth and power to simply train and organize these guys as infantrymen and still being able to control them without causing a revolution. And this would go on for centuries, right? So the Hussites did not really have the state or the background in order to develop a functional military in that regard. This makes their results all the more astonishing, but in relative terms, because these are still like a relatively underdeveloped force, right, compared to the ones that normally fought, especially in Western Europe at the time. It was not normal to begin with for peasants to even fight, right? So that's why you have to estimate the Hussites, not because they actually did who knows what. The nobility may have had some bias against the use of artillery. Well, I don't really believe that. If anything, I believe that Central Europe was poor enough, especially in these areas like between Bohemian and Hungary, not to have enough artillery compared to other places in Europe. For the rest, actually, every noble, I think, would have at least some guns out there. We know that even in a savage place like Scotland, I made a video about that in the Scottish Army organization of this period. We know that even though the Scottish armies were pretty backwards in many ways, every nobleman, even in the Highlands, at the fringes of the world, had in its little castle some kind of gun, right? And then, of course, there could be bigger ones, but it was unlikely for the smaller powers to have them, to have many of them. During this time, firearms like cannons were still seen as curiosities, thus in areas like the theaters of the Hussite Wars. Right? It can be stated that Zizka's use of these weapons was an important factor in his successes, but again, not more than practically any other element in the army that I can think of. I mean, the Wagon forts were possibly even more important per se than the same guns, so there is nothing really, so relevant about this new technology being, capable to compare to even the military use of wagons in warfare, especially from Eastern Europe. Though Zizka's troops were typically armed with farm implements and often outnumbered, the combination of wagon protections, firearms, their will to fight in general enabled them to triumph over adversaries with far greater number of knights. This is the big deal. The fact that peasants could cause a nightly slaughter, that is a slaughter perpetrated on knights, not knights slaughtering peasants as it would have been normally the case, that really impressed anyone who was there to fight in order to just defend Catholicism as a general universal principle that the nobility fully embraced for the historical imperial Catholic tradition that we often discuss in our History of Religion series. Initially, the Hussite Wagenburg or Wagon Fort functioned simply as a means of transporting supplies and light cannons, as it was necessary in the logistics of the era. Every army had these. That's why there wasn't technically even anything relevant about using these. The reason why the Wagon Fort was soon transformed into a crucial combat tool is mostly, as we were saying before, this crucial inferiority of the Hussite armies compared to their enemies, and so the necessity of essentially closing up as a circle, as a square, as we've seen before, also, defending just one side of the formation. This was often done with natural obstacles or field fortification. So what's strange about using wagon force in a desperate situation? That's what you wouldn't use normally as a solution. The fact that you only had those and that the situation was that bad to need to use them for that purpose just explains itself by itself. There is not a tactical genius in the idea of using these wagons. It's rather in the capacity to organize yourself, to predispose these fortifications adequately, to control the defense with enemies attacking from multiple sides, sensing what are the sections of the line they're about to fall, like knowing the individual men in the formation, what kind of quality they're made of. That's tactical genius, right? Together with lots of other things: determination, charisma, coup d'oeil, leadership, for lack of a better word. With limited troop strength, Zizka adapted the wagons into this auxiliary force on the battlefield. At the aforementioned Battle of Sudomir, the wagons were used for both flank protection and transportation. Also, within the lines, you would have needed to transport, a cannon between a fight and another, because you realized that, one side was weaker, especially the flank that was being protected now. You needed a cannon shifted from the front line to the flank. Perfect. If it is especially a big piece, you can move this weapon just on the cart. Like, this is essentially mobile artillery. It's actually appearing gradually on the battlefields of the era. It's said, I made a video about the Battle of Molinella, which is a famous condottieri clash in which sources say that, both sides, or either Colleone or Montefeltro were the commanders in that battle, used this, specifically designed wheeled artillery on the battlefield. But of course, these guys were toying with that. Remember, everything that was done with the Wagenburgs in terms of, complexity of adaptation, of technical, refinement, was normally done already in siege warfare per se. In any situation that witnessed some, again, field fortification, like any kind of the many situations that you could find all over the world. Civilized world was talking about guns at that point. As time passed, the entire Hussite military strategy began to center around the tactics of the Wagenburg, as a mobile fortress made up of armed and fortified wagons. In other words, mostly because of that strategic speed necessity, so not necessarily tactical one, because normally, of course, the wagon fort did not engage in movement, right? They literally used it as a fortress, right? The problem is you have to move this fast both as a strategical and tactical tool, because the armies are going back and forth across hundreds of kilometers, and so you tend to functionalize these wagons for that specifically defensive purpose. There is ingenuity in this, there is great skill, etc. What the Hussites accomplish seems to have been particularly original for the conditions in which they found themselves. However, the ultimate proof that they were doing this radically different or, suddenly innovative use of the wagon fort is actually not supported by any source that I've ever read about Hussite battles. It's a bit like, the 100 Years' War English army. There's actually no source that states that the English ever won because of the longbow, for example. It's just an ex post and much post historiographical reinvention for reasons that mostly are the populistic side of the story. I mean, the notion that the lesser arm, such as the missile one or the foot troops, would be, as the commoners, like the heroes of the situation. Not even at the time they believed in this. There's no source stating it. There is no source actually saying, oh, now the Hussites were thinking they were changing warfare because they were taking on knights with this tactic. None of that, especially none at the time, ever interpreted this in that way, because this is a completely novel, modernistic, secularistic view, not just of, history in general, but of warfare. Warfare does not work like that. right? What the Hussites did was great because they were greatly motivated, and they really hated their enemies, and they really were very well led. But other than that, the means with which they would have used this may have, of course, been part of their identity. They may have sparked a sense of pride. No doubt the technical side is important, but it's not central to them, right? Nor to anyone else, but contemporary people. The Hussites modified their wagons by increasing the height of the sides and reinforcing them with heavy timbers that featured loopholes for firearms. This is obvious, as this was the side exposed to the enemy. So you have this wall. The siege warfare had plenty of this fixed kind of wooden screens, as you know, including the holes for for shooting through them, different ways to rise and lower the screen, not to show what was happening behind in terms, also especially the loading of the cannon, so that you could shoot suddenly and making the enemy, more scared sometimes than he should have been sometimes. So all tricks you see in the warfare of the time. Naturally, having to defend mostly from these wagons, these are the needed modifications. The wheels were also made more durable because, as you understand here, that they're more exposed to the enemy themselves. So, say if somebody's shooting at you or a stallion smashes into the structure, it's actually a massive damage. These have to become ever more robust structures. Soldiers inside were equipped with weapons like arquebuses, even though more traditional weapons were prevalent. The Hussites may have been pioneers in firing their weapons from the shoulder instead of braced against walls or rocks, but this is also somehow speculative. Never really heard of this. The real pioneers in using arquebuses were the more collectively drilled and tactically performing arquebusiers units in Western Europe, where they also had better means and all, including actually bigger guns to begin with, right? Again, the amount of firearms used by the Hussites compared to the Western army was fairly low, right? So again, you see how historiographically the notion that technological innovation prevailed when you don't even compare to what other countries just a few hundreds of kilometers away were doing in the same ways, that you should actually say, well, maybe that's more important because, it doesn't seem that even for the Hussites, these weapons would have been a big deal, right? It's also just historiographical speculations. It's not like we get from the sources that the Hussites made any particular use of arquebuses. They had them, like in any other European army. They largely had less of them, also because they cost a lot, especially the gunpowder. And again, it was easier to fight with a crossbow. The Hussites linked chains and positioned soldiers with pikes, flails, and halberds. The normal function of these weapons is respected, of course, also in the Hussite case. First of all, you don't stop a cavalry charge with any other weapon than a pike, right? You can use the wagon fort. The horse cannot fully smash through that. Of course, the gaps between the wagons are relatively weak points. However, we shouldn't exaggerate this too much. In any case, it just takes to chain them, right? And especially if you are defending between, there isn't a commander that can enter them and actually have gaining any tactical advantage. In order to break a formation, there are soldiers inside with these weapons. You have to fight as a formation, all right? The story that small gaps in warfare are exploited by the enemy to destroy the formation, it's complete and utter BS. It never happened. People confuse all the time the natural gaps that exist between every unit with the gaps of, say, an entirely broken line, say, I don't know, one wing collapses, or there's a hole in the center where literally like an entire unit can pass and or mostly attack the enemy from the flank while it's still engaged. These are two completely different things. So if the clashes were small, of course, like the greater the chances that, I don't know, a man-at-arms could enter through these gaps, but at large, like a cavalry unit could not charge into the gap between the wagons. Of course, you could hope to open up the link, the circle, like the single trail of wagons. But, you know, if you have pikemen in between, like, it's a bit difficult. Guys with flails were useful, especially, I'd say, on the wagons, because, you know, the flail does something like passing over, like, the same flail, like the handle, I mean, and smashing into, let's say, an enemy's back because it got above his head, right? Especially, you can smash someone behind his shield in that way. Halberds are sort of can openers. These are mostly weapons that you find in the infantries of the time behind the pikemen, because the notion is that cavalry would actually charge into the pikemen. It's not the weapon that stops the cavalryman per se. Individually can work like that, but collectively, what stops the cavalry charge is the resolve of the pikemen. Otherwise, like in all history, and that's the reason why cavalry was dominant, the cavalry would actually charge into the pikes and smash the formation. But if this happened, someone would break through some section, and if the cavalry charge was not enough to break through, at some point the horse stops, and that's the most dangerous moment because it loses that smashing power, and so the man and the horse become vulnerable, and you have all these bludgeoning weapons that I made an entire video on that are designed exactly to demolish these men-at-arms, causing devastating trauma underneath the armor, simply opening it, even it, or crippling the horse's hooves, and so on. But it's also not an ideal situation for the horsemen to begin with, so it's mostly like the cohesion of the wall formation, as we were saying that makes the difference. There's this other notion, the Hussites use the pavises. Oh my god, you know, this heavy shields that you can use. I don't know, I will make a video specifically about pavismen. I actually made one recently about 1485 from the Persian manuscript illustration. And I already explained the story a little bit, but I don't know how to explain that, but there is nothing even specifically relevant in pavis. It's just like a shield, aside from the fact that it's true that the Hussites, being less armored than their opponents, would make more profitable use of a large shield. This is the case throughout all history, but in this sense, the pavis is nothing glamorous. It was used everywhere. It likely developed for specifically anti-projectile function, but it worked, of course, in other ways. We'll talk better about this, but it's just a shield, right? If you think that warfare gets down to the type of shield, I think we're seriously missing some fundamentals here. Minimal armor, as we were saying, this also to much credit of the Hussites that evidently could fight with great bravery. But the point is, your best defense is cohesion, it's not armor. Remember that. Crossbowmen, as we were stressing before, provided overarching support. That's literally as the most important missile weapon overall, because they make most of the volume of fire. There were bigger guns sometimes. Consider that the Hussites plunder many towns, they capture many castles, so they are able to seize large, say relatively large amounts of guns. They actually are very burdensome from a logistical point of view, very costly, so there aren't more than many, and again, Bohemia at large doesn't have too much material wealth. Let's say, yes, I don't know, that there is Kutnahora, there are important resources, but at large, like there are not as many cannons in Bohemia, like as even in Germany, that also didn't have as many as France, say. Some of these larger pieces could be placed on mounds of earth within the Wagenburg to allow shots to be fired, say, over these walls of carts. This ideally, if there is such a thing like a mound within, say, within the wagon fort, you would say, well, okay, does it matter? Well, yes, it matters, because if you bring with yourself a major cannon that is also, let's be honest, disproportionately useless to a degree compared to other weapons, like you would have better had many more crossbowmen, right? In theory, like if you're defending, yes, that cannon will be useful, but again, if you don't have an adequate hole where to shoot from, that also can't be exploited in that case, maybe by some more men than just between, say, the gap between the wagons. You may be carrying that for no broader purpose. Mostly these cannons would be used against castles, which is the actual point of it all. Reason for which it would be justified to take them with you if you were a Hussite army, but doesn't mean that you could simply use them tactically wise. You can use them with mitraille at close range, that, as you know, pretty useful. Otherwise, cannons are used, as you know, since Crécy is the most famous battle in which we think the first time the bombard was used. But at large, they're not. They're becoming really important as field guns already at this point in history, towards the 20s of the 15th century, but mostly in other countries, mostly in Western countries, not so much in these ones. But you would have had to have them to a degree. Zizka also crafted a unique set of tactics for the effective use of his wagons. He became master of offensive defense, essentially advancing strategically his wagons to critical locations and compelling the enemy to engage him. That is to say, we are a mobile fortress, so we sit here, try to dislodge us, because if we sit here, you're done for, depending on the military objectives there to achieve. May hit the logistics. It could be just depends on the Schwerpunkt, as a matter of fact. There isn't that notion that the wagon forts would be used again to surround an enemy in attack, right? It's fantasy. There is no actual proof this having ever happened. Nevertheless, it is true that the Hussites were, at least in sedentary Europe, the guys who made apparently greater use of these wagon forts in also in terms of outcome and general ingenuity. This is true, but again, the wagon fort also does not allow you to do more than much. All right. A Hussite army typically comprised around 6,000 individuals on the march. So it's actually a pretty small army as well. It works quite economically to some extent. It would have been very difficult, even just for logistical reasons, to have more troops than these, which did happen, but of course in moments which there were more supplies and general operational possibilities. There is a sense that these men are, again, fanatic. They are motivated. They have the sense of belonging, esprit de corps, general purpose for being there. Actually, you can argue that most of them in a given moment did not have any other way to live but that one, because they would have been cut down elsewhere, and or they would have starved to death. There are terrible things happening in Bohemia at this time, including famine, and also because of the war that is basically destroying the country. So there are many desperates that join the Hussite ranks. The most striking figure, to some extent, tactically, is how quick such troops were, albeit being non-professionals of war, but now with mounting military experience, to adapt various defensive formations ad hoc. It's been estimated that each row of wagons, so to say, functioned as a standardized arrangement containing 60 wagons and 1,200 to 1,500 men. So a very compact formation, ideal for defense, in which likely everybody knew what to do, what their place was during the engagement. You can imagine all the work behind this fortification, how much support could be delivered with, essentially, we can say reserves, because, well, it depends. There wouldn't always be like the square circle, right? At times they would engage with an open front, right? So we don't, armies at this time do not have too many reserves. Again, 15th century warfare passes from in-depth information to some sort of linear ones, speaking of the battle lines, so with a center and wing rather than, I don't know, multiple lines in depth. But it can happen, of course, and in general, I would like to stress, having given a look to different battles of the year and knowing a bit the historiography of the time, that the level of detail of these accounts from a tactical point of view is fairly low, right? We do not understand well what technically happened. So most of, say, how the Hussites functioned like in combat is not really clear. We know, of course, it was a big deal, but our reconstruction capacity, unfortunately, is very limited. So much has been, if you, I don't know, this is not the time of forums or blogs anymore, but if you search for these topics on the internet at large, you will see how people fixate of how, well, the explanation of how it actually worked. Like, man, notoriously, nobody knows, all right? There are some things that we know, but the most simplistic, deterministic, technologistic, materialistic explanations have nothing to do, not just with the Hussites, but with military history in general. So, calm down, read the accounts, research, like, reconstruct these battles and campaigns and realize what we're talking about, because it's not like an infinite amount of sources, right? You can dominate. If you study them for years, you can easily say, okay, I know everything, literally how it worked. You can be the expert about Hussite Warfare, right? I don't know how many there are out there. I'm trying to cover this on my own, but don't overly exaggerate things. Hell, we don't even know how major 100 Years' War battles were actually fought. What do you think you know about 15th century Czech warfare? I mean, seriously. Not knowing the difference immediately tells you that you don't know essentially much about nor the Hussites, nor about medieval warfare in general. Now, taking a cue from the great warrior kings of England, that surely had been a source of inspiration for their sort of foot stand, Zizka skillfully maximized the advantages of the terrain while creating weaknesses for the enemy to exploit. It's interesting, for example, that for the Hussites, aside from the technologistic idea of the guns, missile warfare is not so overly emphasized. Of course, these armies work with a combined arm tactics because there isn't much else you can do. Actually, the fact that the Wagenburg was established most of the times would suggest that, partly at least in the most defensive circumstances, the fully fledged sort of combined arms tactics at large collective levels, because of the relatively small amount of troops was concentrated in this space, was not really enacted. But of course, as we were saying before, say you have the heavy trooper, then you have the crossbowman. We do know that, of course, there was no other way but the combination of these forces. But for other countries, we need to overemphasize, say, for example, the longbow, right? Also, any other army at the time used missile element in the same way, right? The myth that longbow is actually more performing than a crossbow, unfortunately, is a hard one to die. But for some reason, people want to find the simplistic monofactorial explanation and live in with it, remaining that narrow-minded. An alert and well-prepared Hussite force defending on their chosen ground could inevitably conquer a strong opponent, Zizka's disciplined troops were essential for executing these tactics. Thus, he rigorously trained his peasant soldiers. Remember, he was a man-at-arms himself. Some people would say he was a mercenary, right? I don't like the word. I think soldier is better because there's this sense of stigma, but at the end of the day, as we've seen, he had fought abroad. This is the age of, if not of military companies, but at least, the finest troops around mostly are from these, at the end of the day, smaller noblemen that do not have many resources on their own. We had with the affirmation of the princely oligarchies, so they seek their fortune abroad and as knights errant, but mostly framed within war band, like say military companies. The Hussite peasant soldiers could be counted on to form the Wagenburg, as we've seen, establish its defenses and hold their ranks. This was a big deal. It mostly derived from the determination of this man. But training was also necessary. Without this discipline, Zizka's forces would have easily succumbed during their first engagement outside the Wagenburg, a fate that befell many other Hussite commanders, but not Zizka, because Hussite military history is very complex. Zizka is so central to it, but he doesn't stay around forever, and there are so many ramifications in the Hussite field, also from a doctrinal point of view. As we said, they started also killing each other at some point, so these are still more than Hussite armies as a military brand. They're just medieval Bohemian armies, right? You could also cross there the Bohemian at large. They are not behaving in any particularly distinctive way. In fact, Zizka consistently maintained a reserve of infantry and even a small cavalry contingent ready to sally forth while keeping most of his troops anchored to the Wagenburg. The small reserve of infantry was necessary to block any breakthrough that could happen across the line. We've seen it in similar defensive infantry battles, in the Battle of Courtrai. The cavalry reserve, even a few, like a squadron of horsemen, was necessary at point to fall on the enemy flank, which is such a universal tactic. Mostly you have to wait for the enemy to be fully engaged with his battle line with yours, and if the commander of this reserve has enough coup d'oeil, knows when to act, and is able to time everything out successfully, you can fall on the enemy flank and breaking the entire line, even with a handful of knights. You can be a few tens, even not even necessarily maintaining this great cohesion, but just from a psychological point of view, being attacked from the flank is devastating. I wrote an entire article, I still have to publish, on flank attacks. I will not digress on that. If anything, I can actually talk about it on Schwerpunkt directly. Unless I publish it with someone forbidding me to copy it online. And the point, however, is that this tactic is very universal. It's very mysterious in a sense because we mostly know of it when it succeeded. And considering the frequency, it seems impossible that it succeeded only when the reserve was used to begin with. So the notion is that there would be these reserves around, but just only one would successfully manage to break the enemy. Sometimes sources hide it a bit, especially in the more chivalric phases, but it's what every army would have used at some point. Zizka's innovative campaigning style was a thing also, involving aggressively pursuing routed enemies, capitalizing upon victory, which, as we were saying before, was actually a problem for any infantry-based army. So the mobility of the Wagenburg at large, which, as you understood, equated to the Hussite army itself, was a testament, not much of, I don't know, they had some combustion engine discovered in the 15th century for pressing on the enemy that others wouldn't do. No, it's about drive. It's about determination. It's about hatred. You really want those people dead. And especially you know that if you don't pursue them, especially these are knightly armies, right? They can't reform. And so at the moment, you have this great opportunity to simply capture these guys, to take them, and not to ransom them. You slaughter them. Because remember, these are religious fanatics. They don't have a future. There is no place in which they can spend their money for a ransom. Right? It may have happened, surely it did happen, like it wasn't forbidden. But remember, this is a vicious, ideologically fanatic cause. And the ultimate objective is exterminating these enemies. Also, in the name of their own faith, that is to say, the Hussite heresy, against these Catholic crusaders. Remember, this is also from the other side, a very old style, not at all, again, secular or modern reality of actual religious war. All war was religious. In fact, this is a definition that I don't use, but I want to stress it because I want to apply it in the narrative of this video to the context, right, of the time. Remember that, especially in this world, as we've seen often in the series about Vienna 1683, crusades stopped in the 18th century, right? It's a different world from the more, say, recent ones of ours, but also, say, more fairy tale-like, more primitive, also from the other side, than other places that we're knowing, say, humanism, the Renaissance. This is really like blood and toil. It's really a incredibly brutal, savage, underdeveloped, merciless reality where literally nobody cares, even about their enemies in this side. And the Crusaders want to exterminate the heretics, by the way, in a total way, so the feeling is reciprocated from the Hussite side. Another innovative campaigning style included conducting winter operations. It's not like they didn't happen. There is this myth that, say, everybody stopped fighting in winter, Middle Ages, or up to very late in time. This is not correct. Like, major armies, of course, had normally to stop, and this is why Zizka's style is so cool. But remember, it's also a relatively small force. They are desperate. They are hungry, by the way. So this wouldn't happen all the time. But essentially beating the enemy on time, way before then, what kind of weapons used, whatever, is a major strategic advantage. Right? It's a major strategic quantity, per se. Zizka and his men are pursuing that, executing rapid strategic movements successfully. Right? This is very, very important. What the territory makes here is fascinating, because the Hussites are defending against Sigismund Crusaders an essentially compact hilly region in Europe. It's a mixed reality. Also a dense mix of feudal estates, towns, and royal castles. So there is much room for political maneuver. There are lots of places where you can entrench yourself, because again, there is not like the open field Wagenburg stand. There is protection provided by some of these communities that provide also with further troops. Castles have that usual strategic function. Feudal estates can provide you with enough resources. Most of all, this is devastated. Bohemia is not that small. It's roughly 320 kilometers from east to west and about 290 from north to south. It's not infinite, it's not immense, but it's quite compact. In general, when you look at medieval power, as you know, there is no such thing like a definitive border, right? There are some, say, seigneuries at large that you can project your control on as an overlord. However, these are all very fluidly changing side. There is no front line as a consequence during a civil war like in the Hussite uprising. Royalist noble estates, for example, were dispersed throughout the landscape, adding to the chaos. Like, if you wonder how the country went destroyed in the process, it's really stemming from the intertwinement of the royalist and Hussite towns, for example. People siding both groups are present in the same communities. Everybody has something to gain from this in a way or another, because even if you don't want war, upheaval, instability, this will happen anyway. So at that point, you will have to pick a side. This is kind of obvious. It belonged to the general political culture of the time as well, because these communities were constantly agitated for some reason, right? The moment of simple peace in the, like, I don't know, medieval movies normally start like, or at least they show you before the storm arrives. Everything is happy, everybody's working fine. It's as if, you know, that these places weren't rife with just political machinations, violence, heavy involvement in fact, endeavors, wars, religious movements. That's what they normally don't show you, because they make you want to believe that essentially the world would be just fine if people were left on their own, and it's always the other's fault if something happens, right? It's always the brute that decides to impose you know, taxes and make and banqueting on a pile of money just to trigger you. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. That's not how it actually works. In any case, although Prague held the position of the geographical and cultural heart of Bohemia from centuries, this is since essentially the 9th century, the center of Hussite authority often shifted between Prague and Tabor at this time. Tabor, by the way, is such a nice town today. It's one of the typical Middle European and very Bohemian, very Czech center that really expresses in its nicety, like the contrasting nature of these lands, like this horror that emerges from the soul, like the blood of the Hussites. I made a book review about Walpurgisnacht that actually discussed this for Prague, that in many ways is big and intimidating, but Tabor is even better to a degree, because this will become the center of one of the single most radically, overwhelmingly, and traumatically vicious sects in the history of mankind. And so much ruthless violence would be delivered from that. It makes you understand what human nature is really about. In fact, this was a significant Hussite stronghold in the south. At some point, the Hussites themselves are called Taborites because of the prevalence of this group for a while. They were really the intransigent ones, the vicious mother blippers that were eventually put down like animals in the end. Strategically positioned between these two hubs were royalist towns and castles, with two of Bohemia's most formidable royal ones, especially castles, remaining untouched within Hussite-controlled Prague for months. As you understand, this would make them very important strategic outposts. At the beginning of the war, Pilsen and Kutna-Hora, very important centers in the kingdom, stood as key royalist towns. They're fortified. The latter, as you know, is the center of major mining activity that has also recently been discovered and exploited. A lot of precious metals come into the royal coffers from there. These centers would serve as operational bases for both local and invading royalist forces. The Hussites found themselves cut off in their insurrection, because essentially from one side you had the Germans that would historically intervene in Bohemia. We've seen this very often, but especially at this point, because, or at least at this point, especially because Sigismund was both German and Hungarian king, as well as Bohemian king, the Germans were adversaries of the Czechs. We can't say that it was just a primordial hatred or something, but historically the Ostsiedlung showed that there was a very strong sense of difference between these ethnicities. Made a video about the Ostsiedlung, and it was about Poland, Bohemian, Hungary, and in the end we read some anecdotes about essentially Austrian writers about Czech mannerism and how the Germans were in part imitating it at the time Bohemia became a respectable power. The sense, however, was that, as we were saying before, there could be a Holy Roman Imperial control of Bohemia, in fact from a center that was not quite Prague anymore, with lots of also German mercenaries. When we think about the Crusaders of Sigismund, it's also because these knights participated to the crusade, but in many ways these were the years of soldiers of fortune, as we've seen with the same Zizka. It's the time again of the indenture of the condottieri. We've seen this. Germany has a strong tradition in that. Probably Bohemia has too, and it's relatively underrated. We'll talk more about Czech warfare because it's so really fascinating, really. Both countries maintain some kind of traditional feudal outlook, but it's essentially for this that the idea of the knight errant, of the warbender, basically flows into these companies and their nefarious activities. Then you have Hungary to the east, to the southeast. That is a major power. It's very separated into oligarchic principalities of sort, but in this case it represented Sigismund's stronghold. The Magyar kingdom has historically a great rivalry with the German and also the Bohemian one. There is this triangle in between, mostly the Markfeld, that opens to the steppes. You would have seen, in fact, those aforementioned Cumans raiding, so Moravian territories, coming from Hungary, from the various nomads that were settled in the Pannonian Basin up to very late in time, but it's a Hungarian crown. There would be a sense of rivalry for the respective ambitions of these countries. They were fairly well outlined now in their respective boundaries, but as you understand here, the political lines blur and overlap because there is a single monarch for all of these lands. Betrayal was consequently common on both sides. Changing sides was completely normal. It depended on the circumstances. Imagine having hundreds of actors in the form of different seigneuries, lordships, towns, cities, etc., and really all calibrating their response to local and international events after very pragmatic considerations. A number of nobles who initially supported the revolt, for example, defected to the royalists later, abandoning their commitments and hopes. This is especially true for the lesser nobility, because the greater oligarchs were obviously more tied to the constituted order. There was a pretty firm monarchy, having established itself in the centuries, regardless of the more recent troubles. you want to keep this standing. As we've seen, these were at large the same oligarchs that had once called a foreign king to rule on their land, having all the local ethnic prejudices against, imagine, the Luxembourgs, again, speaking French. That is something that really the Czechs do not hear that often. They hear a lot of German, to some Pole and Hungarian, but say the Luxembourgs are in many ways complete strangers. But that's exactly why they have chosen them, right? It's a bit like the Habsburgs, the move from an opposite end to another of Germany, or the Angevins that come to rule in Hungary or in Poland. These oligarchs wanted a weak monarch, an elected one that depended on them, regardless of the eventual power they would gain. I mean, think about, again, Charles IV, that is such a great example, that especially revitalized Bohemia, gave it much stronger basis. And the oligarchs at that point were still negotiating their own privileges, their own prerogatives, but fundamentally happy for being able to share the cake, right, of this more compact kingdom. The more compact it was, the more in their hands technically was. So these are the guys that do not defect, at least normally, and that, however, get damaged the most, because eventually the Hussite rebellion is successful in undermining their power, as a consequence undermining the one of the entire kingdom, that, regardless of this privatistic oligarchic mentality, had at least historically developed in some more virtuous direction. It's rather the smaller nobility like Zizkas that fundamentally sees this rebellion as an opportunity for rising status. It's not like they didn't believe in the Hussite cause from a religious point of view, for example. They wouldn't even necessarily see this as much of a theological matter. It was really understood in ways that only a 15th century Bohemian knight would have been able to explain to you, not for you even to simply understand, of course. But of course, in the essentially Protestant nature of the Hussite movement, you realize that there was an idea of broader liberty, broader autonomy, in some cases anarchy, for essentially countering a priesthood that the secular element had always seen in, at least competitive terms, and that now seemed like a declining element in a failing order that could simply be taken over, right? Let, the priests be poor. There is a lot of hate within the church. Like, in fact, the bishops, the higher ecclesiastical authorities in Bohemia are loyal to the king, as it's normally the case in medieval realms, whereas the more radical agitators, even made a video about the Utraquist priest of the Hussite Wars for the historical military units series. The Utraquist page, like the notion that, of course, both wine and bread was acceptable by anyone in the community. So the both sides, essentially, that were smaller figures, but were extremely more radical, violent, like openly inciting violence and bloodshed, right? Not always, but the hypocrisy, the idealism, the notion that, yes, you have to change the order because, a bit of bloodshed now will surely not damage, and everything has to be run by nobody knows whom even. So there are, of course, deep communistic traits in Hussitism. There is no doubt about this. It's a very complex phenomenon. It's not that easy to explain, but at large, the direction was populistic, anti-Catholic, anti-imperial. It was all based, anti-clerical, of course. It was all based on destroying authority. Remember that populism is not a good thing. What you witnessed from the left and now from the right, normally, now it's the same thing. right? These people have flattened themselves to the same whiny BS that they're victims and that it's other people's fault. And when things will not change for the better, because they aren't anyway, it's difficult to know who they will blame. At least they will blame anyone, depending on who is more successful, but that's always a trend. Captured royalists were spared at times during the Hussite Wars in hopes of forming alliances with the Hussites themselves. Many subsequently returned to the king's side, however, proving that, of course, the cream of Bohemia did not want to know about this radical movement at all, and that they preferred the established order. That's what brought, as we were saying before, to the actual extermination. Especially when these individuals, especially when they were not Bohemian, when they were Hungarians, when they were Germans, right? That did resonate. I mean, even if, as we were saying before, especially in Bohemia, this strictly, say, conventionally ethnic divide between Czechs and Germans had a lot of gray areas. When in open field you heard your enemies shouting at you in German, in Hungarian, it would be all a different story. Even more so when you would actually lead raids within the same Hungary at some point, so you would even more recognize, your victims at that point. It's an extremely vicious conflict that, as we've seen, intertwines politics in general, of course, like religion, nationality, social status, infinite divides within the same aspects, right? So, really a very complicated story. As a consequence, allegiances among towns frequently shifted. Towns were a bit more, say, supportive of the Hussite cause because they felt neglected in the broader representation of the kingdom. This wouldn't become suddenly so important during Hussite times. It was the bigger centers, of course, that had the lion's share, but there was some kind of further organization on the town base, because these Czech towns are relatively, as we've seen with Tabor, for example, like relatively supportive. There aren't so many other big centers, so they tend to bond a bit more, and to see in the Hussites maybe some interesting pole to support, to supply. Mostly that's the point. Towns had historically been founded in Bohemia by the same kings, right, to in fact counter the oligarchy. So they maintain a bit this bias against, especially here there is no king, as you understand, right? Mostly that's the point. Your king is a foreign king now that is coming to invade you. So the main problem, as we've seen, are the oligarchs that back the king, and so the towns understand that maybe this is a moment in which they can gain more by supporting the rebellion. I made a video that I think I have to re-upload because it's one of the old pictures that thus I don't often insert in the related videos list, but that discusses this, especially during the at the Diet of Bohemia, that witnessed some greater representation also from the towns, but also speaking of the internal balance of the towns, what the patriciate thought about the Hussites, etc. However, towns would also embrace royal policy at a point. Towns could be sacked by the Hussites as a consequence, but at large they needed them as logistical points of supply. The Hussites often responded harshly to treason in general, reconquering the towns that had switched side and executing hundreds of their residents. This tells you how, sensitive they were to a degree. I would stop here for today. I was planning to make this actually in just one video, but I realized that there is so much to say that it's good to make one chunk at a time. This makes me save not recording time, but production time, meaning that, you know, I will store some videos. So some of the last months have been crazy in terms of, I wish I had worked. I managed to work, but I also lost a lot of time for some issues. This is not a problem for now. In any case, I'm keeping, of course, the same old rhythm. As you understand, Hussite history is really messy. I don't remember how many videos I made about medieval medieval Bohemia, yes, but about the Hussites, I don't think I even ever created, or maybe yes, a playlist, because yes, I did talk about them. Yeah, there's surely a playlist, but let me check. Hussites. There ain't really. Yeah, because it's not like I've done too many videos on them, but I think I must. There is, however, of course, a video playlist about medieval Bohemia, which I just recently replenished. 24 videos. Well, I'm glad. I'll tell you what. Here, how many on Hussite Bohemia? 1, 2, 3, 4. No, 5. Well, there is plenty. So why haven't I created? I'm going to immediately create a Hussite playlist because it's so obviously relevant. Can't believe I skipped it. Ah, no, I have them. Here I search for it. It's just dumb YouTube that doesn't show it in even my own search. If you check among the playlists, yes, I made there are 3 playlists: Hussite Army, Hussite Warfare, Hussite History. So it's really great. Let's see how many views, because these are small playlists, and usually they don't make so much. Yeah, in fact, it's really minimal. Some playlists make really thousands of views per play. Let's say not because not a single videos. I mean, the single videos have a different count on their own. Ah, here minimal. How is it possible? I thought people were obsessed with this stuff, or maybe there is so much out there they don't watch my own content. I know by fact that there are lots of videos about the Hussites out there. Yeah, minimal relevance. Whatever. Let's hope to increase it, because when it kicks in, I think we will be unstoppable. Very well. I will continue, like, of course, in another episode. I will, of course, cover different, like, everything concerning the Hussites in terms of battle. Every single battle we will cover, but we will also make many videos about Hussite Bohemia in general, so it's just a matter of time. If I have time, I'm going to make them. Don't worry. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.